to Leading for Life Stories Season 3. I'm Bob Judson, I'm the host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Regardless of whether you're a seasoned listener who's been with me since the beginning, or whether you've just dropped in for the occasional episode, I really hope you enjoy the mix of content that I provide, the personal stories, the thematic episodes, and the guests that I have on the show. And I hope you find it all interesting and at least some of it useful. And without further ado, let's go. Welcome back, everybody. Another phenomenal guest this week on Leading for Life Stories. It's my absolute privilege to be talking to Lord George Robertson. George was the Secretary of State for Defence for the UK in the immediate aftermath of the Labour landslide win in 1997, and he subsequently went on to become Secretary General of NATO and is the only, so far at least, Secretary General to have ever declared Article 5 for NATO. That's the collective security guarantee, which is effectively an attack on one is an attack on all. And that was in the immediate aftermath of the terrible terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers in New York in 2001. He's still, as you'd expect, very, very authoritative and active in defence, and most recently was the lead author of the UK Strategic Defence Review. With the current Labour government having taken over just over a year ago, that defence review having been published earlier this year. And what better guest to have in the turbulent geopolitical times that we currently face, with war in Europe, war in the Middle East, lots and lots of real challenges in the political space more generally. And he opines on all of those things, as you would expect, as well as talking a lot about his own personal leadership journey in the normal fashion that we do on these podcasts. So it's a terrific interview, really, really relevant to what's going on today, hugely interesting, hugely informative by someone who I think genuinely is an amazing statesman, real international player who deserves all the credit he gets for what he has achieved over his life, which is phenomenal. So without further ado, off we go. George, what a privilege to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for sparing me the time to be here today. I'm sure it's going to be an amazing conversation.
Well, it's lovely to speak to you. I never really knew how many podcasts there were until we finished the defence review, and I seem to have been on podcasts ever since. I wonder where people find the time to actually listen to them.
I know, it's really interesting. I think a lot of people like the long format kind of thing because actually you get a bit more in depth. You get under the skin of some of the stuff, where quite often some of our news media, it's just so superficial. It skips over things in a really quick and kind of unfulfilling way in some ways. So I think that's part of it. But you're right, there are a lot of podcasts out there.
Yeah, sound bites never really give you the full picture. So it is useful, and I listen to them in the car and in the garden and things like that. So it's always informative, and especially when you've got somebody who's got something interesting to say.
And you most definitely have got that. So I'm really looking forward to what we have to discuss. I mean, by any measure that you care to use, you've had an amazing career, and you've mostly political, obviously. Member of Parliament for a long time. Then post the Labour landslide in 1997, Secretary of State for Defence. That's actually where I first met you. You might not remember that, but at Greenwich, when I was at the Joint Service Defence College, you came there, and that was literally the day after or 2 days after the election, and that was amazing actually to watch that election and see some kind of giants of the political establishment lose their seats. It's the first time I'd ever seen that happen in my lifetime, and it was extraordinary. But then obviously on Secretary General of NATO, and you're the first and so far only the Secretary General of NATO to have declared Article 5. So that's a pretty amazing list of achievements. But I'd love you to put a bit of flesh on those bones, if you would, and just tell us about your life journey from start to present day in a short summary.
Well, in short, I was born in the tiny village of Port Ellen at the island of Islay. In the police station in Port Ellen, my father was the local policeman, and it's now been renamed Robertson House, converted into bed sits for young people. So I grew up there in a village of 300 people, but yet it's a village where 2 British cabinet ministers were educated, where two presidents of the Royal Society of India came from, and where two men called Alexander McDougall, one was a shipbuilder in America who built two shipyards, 200 ships at the Great Lakes. And the other, Alexander McDougall, a century before, was one of the leaders of the American War of Independence and rose to be a major general in the Continental Army and ultimately the first president of the Bank of New York. So, for a small village, packs a big punch. I then moved to Dunoon. My father was moved there, and it coincided, my time in Dunoon coincided with the arrival of the American nuclear submarine base at the Holy Loch, and I got involved in politics at that time. The protesters came to protest against it, and I was part of that demonstration. A bit embarrassing for my father, who was the head of the local CID. I was going round on my bike finding campsites for the demonstrators, and then he was arresting them when they demonstrated. So I went to, when I finished school, went to Dundee University, then part of St Andrews University, in order to get to the other side of Scotland. And I took part in a lot of political activities in the university. I'm now the Chancellor of the university, so the wheel has come round full circle. But I was engaged heavily in student politics during that time, and had a marvellous 4 years before managing to scrape a degree at the end of that. I then went to work for a trade union in Glasgow, the General of Municipal Workers Union, now called the GMB, and I got made an organiser, full-time official, looking after mainly the whisky industry, the manual workers and the Scotch whisky industry, and therefore travelled throughout Scotland looking after that. 9 years I did that. It was a bruising time and a real learning experience, I have to say. Got rid of a lot of the more ideological views that I had at that time. But I was then asked to stand as a parliamentary candidate in a by-election, 3 quite important by-elections that Labour had in 1998. Donald Dewar was elected in the first one, Garscadden with a pro-SNP swing. I was elected in Hamilton against Margaret MacDonald with a pro-Labour swing, and then John Hugh Robertson was elected in Berwick and East Lothian. So I got into the House of Commons in 1978, spent 6 months on the back benches, and then one night when a number of parliamentary private secretaries voted against the government on some obscure European legislation, I got propelled into being parliamentary private secretary to David Reynolds, who was then Secretary of State for Health and Social Security. Huge government department. But anyway, 6 months later, we lost the election, and Jim Callaghan appointed me to the front bench. I never left the front bench my whole time at the House of Commons. I was first of all a spokesman on Scottish affairs, then on defence. I was the Shadow Minister of the Navy, and then I got moved to Foreign Affairs and under Dennis Healy, and I then became the Chief European Spokesman and made my name by opposing the major government on the Maastricht Treaty ratification, which we tortured them with for a period. At the end of that, I was elected to the Shadow Cabinet as a consequence of my work on Maastricht, and became the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland, and then supervised the devolution legislation led to the creation of the Scottish Parliament. So, although I don't often boast about it, and I played a major part in the foundation of what is now the 25-year-old Scottish Parliament. Come the election in 1997, Tony Blair decided to put Donald Dewar as Secretary of State for Scotland, a position I had been rehearsing for. And I was, to my great pleasure, appointed Secretary of State for Defence. So I went from a staff of 3.5 people as the Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland to having 383,000 people working for me, and an army, a navy, and an air force as well. In the Ministry of Defence, we first of all did a strategic defence review, known now as the SDR 1998. I said at the time, if it had been a failure, it would have been called the Robertson Review, but it's known as the SDR 1998. And then we fought the war in Kosovo, and we won it. It took 78 long days, but eventually we achieved what we set out to do, which was NATO in, Serbs out, refugees home, and we succeeded with all three of these. In many ways, I became very prominent at that time because of the Kosovo conflict, and when Javier Solana said he was standing down as Secretary General of NATO in order to become the EU's High Representative on Foreign Policy, Tony Blair asked me several times to go and be Secretary General of NATO, and I did so very, very reluctantly because I was doing the best job in the British government at that time. And I went to Brussels in 1999, and we had the residue of Kosovo to deal with. I then had an uprising, an insurgency in what is now North Macedonia to deal with. And at the end of that, when we actually produced a peace agreement, and the current Deputy Secretary General of NATO used to be the Defence Minister of North Macedonia, very successful peace agreement. Then 9/11 came along that same year, and as you said, I invoked Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, saying that an attack on America had to be seen as an attack on all. Quite a pivotal moment in the history of the alliance. It may be that I'm the only person who will ever invoke Article 5, because I don't think anybody is going to cross the Article 5 line. In fact, as we speak, I think that the North Atlantic Council is actually discussing Article 4 because Estonia has invoked Article 4, which is, we believe, we are going to be attacked for the incursion of Russian jets in there as well. So my period at NATO was Macedonia, the 9/11, then Afghanistan, and then Iraq. So it was quite a lively period.
Yeah, no kidding. A lot going on in that time frame, that's for sure.
That was my political career, and subsequently I have been involved in the private sector in the House of Lords, and then last year I was asked to lead the 2025 Strategic Defence Review, which we just completed. So yeah, an eventful life so far, and it's not finished yet.
Indeed, not finished by a long way, I hope, and and extraordinary in terms of achievements. We're definitely going to come back and talk about some of that geopolitical side of life towards the latter part of this. But before we do that, just a bit more on you personally. And the podcast is all about leadership, and that's what I try and focus on a lot. And that, as you said, you've moved from very different scale of jobs in terms of people working for you as a leader to some enormous ones. And I'm just really interested in your perspectives on yourself as a leader, how you've adapted your own leadership style, consciously, unconsciously, what's kind of shaped you as you've gone along, and perhaps bolting into that, what kind of leadership traits you think are really important to you and that you want to see in others?
Well, in terms of the Ministry of Defence, that was a huge leadership challenge, going from staff of 3.5 to 383,000. And in as Secretary of State for Defence, you've got to be a manager because you're managing a huge department, multifaceted department of state. And in fact, one of the biggest government departments in Europe. But you're also a cheerleader. You've got to maintain morale. You've got to make sure that people are motivated enough to do that. And that's a balancing act that is quite difficult to do. And occasionally, especially when you've got a constituency, you've got to attend at the same time. It's a difficult balancing act, even inside your own psychology. But I hope I managed that, by essentially my philosophy was you listen, you decide, you explain, and then you execute. So you listen to as many voices as you can, and then you make the difficult decision. And sometimes it goes against what you've heard in the listening process. You've at least taken that into account. Then you make the decision because that's your job. And then you've got to explain it. And I think that's an important feature, especially if you're going against the grain. Then you've got crucially to implement it. And I remember the lesson I was given before we took power at the very brief sort of teaching process we had, where somebody said to me, and I always remember that, set achievable objectives and achieve them. And I think that's a model for the rest of life. It is, because so often, people set very high standards and don't achieve them, or set multiple ambitions, and then they're impossible to deliver on. So it's listen, decide, explain, and execute. That has been the basis of my leadership style in each of the jobs I've done.
It's really interesting. I mean, I when I talk quite a lot to groups about just developing themselves through leadership and business skills and all that sort of thing, I tend to joke a little bit about when I was wearing a uniform. I was in the business of saying, look, we're here to preserve democracy, not necessarily to practice it, because I was very much in the same camp. I wanted to have a robust debate in the room with the people that were my kind of senior team, where they had a chance to air all their views, but I wouldn't necessarily be saying, right, we're looking for absolute consensus. If we could get that, wonderful. But it wasn't primarily about that. It was about, I was in charge. If I was, in particular roles, particular times, then, you have some tough decisions to make. So I think as a leader, that is important to keep that in mind. I do think some of the time leaders in all walks of life tend to think, right, I can't do this because I can't get the agreement of the people. Actually, you need to inspire people. You need to take them with you. You need to justify your own decisions and be accountable when they go wrong as well as when they go right. But I do think it's really, really important that you do make decisions as a leader instead of just flanneling it.
Absolutely, and the key word you used there is inspire. You've got to be able to inspire people that you know what you're doing, that you have a clear vision and a visible strategy. And inspire them to do their best. And I've always said, you employ the best people, even better people than you are, because your job is to lead them and use their skills, together in order to make a team successful.
Yeah, totally. So, and I think actually it's often really important to start employing people or bringing people into the team with you that have differing viewpoints to you, because I think that really strengthens the overall output. If you have too many mini me's, then that's not a great place to be, is it? And as a leader, you don't want people who are just yes men.
Yeah, and a challenge is hugely important. Lawrence Friedman's latest book called Command is basically based on that thing about the most successful leaders are people who are challenged all of the time. And you begin to see, Vladimir Putin, who can take very quick decisions, and they're usually the wrong decisions because there's nobody there to tell him, what he doesn't want to hear.
Yeah, well, let's hold that thought because I'd like to come back and talk a bit more about Vladimir Putin in a little while. But just to dwell on you for a second, two real things from that: role models that have shaped you as you've sort of grown through life. Who are the people that really have probably had the most influence on you?
Well, it's worth thinking about. At school, I had a history teacher, Archie Blair, who was a great inspiration to me in the subject, even although I only did it at O level at the latter stages of that. Professor Ken Alexander is the principal of Stirling University, and he had been the chairman of the Highlands and Islands Development Board. But he was a professor at Strathclyde, and he was a very wise, gentle, dignified, scholarly man. But he always listened to younger people. That was you were powerless, you were useless, you were sort of young, and yet he had the time that he took to listen to you. Laterally, Dennis Healy, who I worked for, remarkable human being, dramatic individual who could have been a great leader of our country. John Smith, my son is married to his middle daughter, but John was somebody that I admired enormously, and he would have been a brilliant prime minister had he lived. And his colleague Donald Dewar, who was one of my closest friends, was also, an example, of really dedicated, committed, good politicians who I thought were really good and models to follow. Internationally, I've thought about it a bit that Vladislav Havel, who was the president of the Czech Republic and who had been the president of Czechoslovakia, a man who had been condemned to jail, to disgrace, working as a boilerman in a hospital, when he was a great, accomplished playwright, and then had no grievance against the people who had tortured him and persecuted him before, and was a really, really fine leader of his country. And the final one in my list of people that I admired was Colin Powell. He was Secretary of State of the United States when I was in NATO, and a remarkable individual, both on a military sphere, but also on a personal level. A great leader, and somebody who I thought was one of the best human beings you could imagine.
Yeah, I'd say that there's some great names on that list, and I absolutely recognise what you say about all of them. Actually, I think that the one that has always struck me on the international stage in terms of your comment about forgiving things that had happened to him in the past was Nelson Mandela. I always think that's a remarkable story for someone who had such kind of oppression through much of his life to then be so measured in the way that he then led South Africa post apartheid and so on. I thought it was extraordinary. Actually, he's another of those characters.
21 years in jail.
Yeah, and having visited Robben Island and looked at the cell he lived in, you think unimaginable, really, to have had the treatment that he did, and then come out in the way that he did. Quite extraordinary, and it's great when we have those kind of humans. I mean, just to digress just slightly from where I was going on the political level. I mean, you mentioned some interesting names in there in terms of political figures who are really very altruistic in terms of their approach to the country and the job and all the rest of it. Do you think in today's world that we have got similar people out there, who are equally going to be in days, years, to months to come, going to be regarded in the same way, or have we been I guess, adversely affected by what we were talking about at the very beginning with the soundbite world, with the social media world, with those kind of things, where it's shaped people in a different way. I'm just interested in your view.
It depends from your vantage point. You know, again, at our age, you know, you're looking at people through a different lens. That you know, we looked at the Dennis Healey's, you know, and the Jim Callaghans. And actually, I'm older now than they were when I was. You know, they were at the peak of their power. But yes, I think there are people still of real significance uh, who are still about and who is still playing a role in political life. Um, the problem is that you know the last election saw 174 incumbent Conservative MPs losing their seats. You know, apart from the ones who had retired, and the 330 new Labour MPs came in. One of whom told me when I was Defence Secretary, she was 4 years of age. Um, you know, there is a different generation coming up, and I think they will be as formidable as previous generations actually were, but they'll be different. They'll be very, very different in the kind of world that politicians have to survive and thrive in today.
Yeah, fascinating. How much difference do you think? Because obviously you're always going to get that turbulence and that churn in the House of Commons in the UK or in pretty much any political establishment around the world, I guess. But when you have these big landslides, then obviously you tend to get, and you've just exemplified the point with all those people losing their seats means that obviously you're getting a whole lot of new MPs replacing them, who by definition really have got a lot less, if any, experience in that space. And that kind of continuity loss, both in opposition terms and in government terms, must impact negatively until you actually spin back up and get everybody back up to speed. And I just wonder, again, your perspectives, and just to add a link onto that. I mean, I've seen when I was in defence, when you see too rapid a changeover of ministers or cabinet ministers, and you're in the official level or in in the military as an officer, you tend to see real challenge there, where you've just about got somebody up to speed with their department, and you'll have seen this with the MOD, that it's a big department, takes a lot of getting used to and a lot of stuff to learn. If someone is transiting through there in a really short space of time, that hurts, doesn't it? And again, your views on all that continuity piece.
Well, you've got to balance continuity with the the need to refresh at the same time, and I think that's where the Prime Minister has to do it. You know, we've gone through a period of real turbulence in recent years. Even Prime Ministers. I got Sir Jeremy Quinn to come and help me in the Defence Review, and he had been a Conservative Minister of Defence Procurement, and certainly one of the best. But he was one of 16 that the Conservative government had during that period. Now that is completely crazy, especially in defence procurement. So there needs to be an element of continuity and a degree of stability in political leadership. But at the same time, you've got to bring on younger people as well. As you know from the military, people you either go up or you go out. And if you try to sort of keep people in senior positions for any great length of time, it blocks up the system, the promotion system as well. And yet you think, the chief of the defence staff is there for 3, maybe maximum 4 years, which is just enough time to learn the job, and then prepare for going again. So there has to be that balance as well. And I think we could do with a period of relative political stability in this country. And I hope that we are actually going to get that.
Yeah, I'm not as optimistic maybe as you are on that. I think looking at the turbulence in the government at the moment, I would never have predicted that the Conservatives, having had such a landslide in 2019, would then lose so spectacularly subsequently. And obviously, the same thing, you look at the current government and the pressure they're under in all sorts of areas. I think it's going to be really interesting to see. And again, I don't think you would have seen that in the past. I think you would have seen longer continuity and of which is not necessarily a good thing when you have 14 years of any flavor of government, really. It gets stale and needs refreshing. But equally, it can be too turbulent. And I don't want to get too political, but I think one of the things that is always a frustration for me is the opposition opposes often just because it's the opposition.
We see that occasionally. My first lecture at Dundee when I went to university was the lecturer was a guy called John Berridge, who was a very active conservative. But he first of all said, look to the left of you and to the right of you, because by the time you graduate, one of you won't be here, which was a bit sobering. But the second thing was he said that in this country, 75% of the seats are so-called safe and never change hands. In Russia, it's only 25% more. That position as it was, that was what, 1964, is now completely changed. No seat is safe. No majority can be regarded as given. So our democracy, has moved on, and essentially, you get the politicians you deserve. People have decided on the present government, and they decided about the last government, and they may well be, depending on what's happening in the opinion polls today, might decide something completely different for the next government.
Yeah.
That's democracy.
Yeah, no, you're right, and I fully support all of that, and makes absolute sense. Um, I tend to talk about highs and lows of any individual's life. What would you consider your career high point to be?
It's difficult to say. I think my children are a big high point of my life. And I'm very proud of them. I've got grandchildren now as well. The creation, the foundation of the Scottish Parliament, putting together the uh, the Scottish Constitutional Convention's plan for a Scottish government, which I then had to persuade the National Party, the UK Party, to adopt in total. That was a really significant achievement at that time. I was part of the campaign to ban the private ownership of handguns after Dunblane. I live in Dunblane, and I think that was really quite significant. Um, the declaration of Article 5 was really a sort of high point in my life because it was a calculated risk. Could have gone horribly wrong if even one country had said no, we don't want to do it, or we're going to put it off for several days. But it worked well, and everybody the following day thought it was their idea. And of course, I've done two strategic defence reviews, both of which have been acclaimed. Uh, and I was part of a team. I led a team as defence secretary, and then the review team. But the team is what achieved it. But I'm very proud of both of these reviews, which I think have massively altered the whole face of British defence.
Yeah, no, that's great. We'll come back to the Article 5 point because I think that's a really interesting one to look at in a second. But sadly, I mean, for every high point in your life, there's going to be a low point somewhere. What's the low point for you?
Well, I was trying to think about that. I don't have many low points, frankly, because of recovery. It's the ability to recover from things. But I kept standing for the shadow cabinet, and I kept losing until I didn't. Oddly enough, if I had succeeded, it might have worked against me when I actually stood. But they were disappointments at the time because I thought I was capable of being on the shadow cabinet and better than some of the people who were elected. But ultimately, I think it worked out well for me.
Nice. Okay, that's really, yeah, really interesting. A very last sort of personal question for you is: you've lived an incredibly busy life and very demanding life with some really demanding appointments. Some people don't like to talk about work-life balance, and just talk about integration of the two and so on. And I subscribe to that a little bit. But what are your top tips really for giving some balance, giving yourself some perspective, de-stressing, relaxing? What kind of stuff do you do?
I think you've got to do something other than your main occupation. I see an awful lot of people, business people, who are focused on their job, 100%, then they retire and usually die very shortly afterwards. So, I am passionate about photography. Um, if you are watching on a screen, you see some of my photographs in the background. We've got an all-party parliamentary photography group and an exhibition every year. So I'm really, that's an escape route from politics. I play golf pretty badly, but I don't lie about it like some people do, and it's quite nice, the fresh air, to do that. So I think you've got to have other interests, other passions, other than your last speech, because that doesn't take you very far.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, we share photography and golf, and I tend to put on my CV. Actually, I put poor quality golf because I love it, but I'm not very good at it. I've never given it enough time to be better at
Yeah.
it. But it's a great game for getting you outside, that's for sure. And I don't go for the Oscar Wilde view that it just spoils a good walk. I think it's yeah, it's good fun. Let's switch tack a bit because I always talk to guests about their areas of expertise. For you, I mean, that very obviously is the defense focus of stuff you've done. I mean, we mentioned Vladimir Putin earlier on. I mean, you've actually met Putin, which obviously not very many people have that are talking about him regularly in the West, certainly. I'm just really interested in your perspectives and whether you're surprised or not surprised by his current actions, given your relationship with him in the past.
Yes, I'm surprised. I got on well with him. It was a time when he had just come to power, and that, I think he was as surprised as everybody else was when he became president so suddenly when Yeltsin resigned on Hogmanay, and he became the acting president of Russia. And I was, I think, one of his very first foreign visitors. I went to Moscow at their invitation, and he was quite clearly determined he was going to clean up some of the bad relationships of his predecessor. And one of them was a falling out with NATO over Kosovo. And he was determined he was going to do that. Not everybody agreed with him on that. And we worked together, met several times, and then I chaired the NATO Russia summit in 2002, where he sat round the table under my chairmanship with the other 19 heads of state and government. And he cracked a joke at the end of the plenary session, and spoke at the press conference afterwards, where he said Ukraine is a sovereign, independent nation which will make its own decisions about peace and security. Um, so we've then seen him develop into a sort of megalomaniac who believes that Ukraine has no right to exist and it'll be violently absorbed into his concept of the new Russia. So determined is he to sort of recreate the respect that the Soviet Union he thinks had, that he is willing to go to wild extremes to do it. So I am surprised that the man that I got to know so well, and who actually wanted to enlist me after my retirement in one of their businesses. That man has now turned into a monster who is now trying to rape and subjugate Ukraine.
What would be your prediction looking forward on that then? Because having turned in that direction, do you think there's a way back, or how do you think this ends?
I don't think that the regime is as strong as some people say. You know, the Mr. Prigozhin, who ran the Wagner group, is a creation of Vladimir Putin. He existed because of Vladimir Putin. He survived, he thrived as a consequence, and he rebelled and said, you know, that the Ukrainian adventure was wrong, and marched on Moscow, almost marched on Moscow at that time. And now the deputy chief of staff has resigned, apparently in disagreement with what's going on. So the regime itself is not as firm as it looks from the outside. And the people round about Putin recognize the damage that is being done to Russia and to the Russian economy. You know, a million people either dead or seriously injured. That is a huge level of casualties in a country like that, where the population, the native population, is actually in decline. You know, Russia will be 50% Muslim by 2050, and in a highly racialist society. That's that's a pretty grim statistic for the ethnic Russians. So a million dead and the economy completely distorted by the war in Ukraine. You know, the long-term future for Russia is really, really bleak. And I think there are people in Russia who recognize that, and they may well make the change that would be required.
Yeah, I was going to say, because with that very bleak future, does that make the outcome more dangerous, or do you think actually they will control that from within? Because it's going to take us into that NATO point in a minute around Article 5, but I'm just interested in the Russia angle first.
Well, people say, well, you know, at least the devil we know is Vladimir Putin. But I don't think anybody could be more violent. He's right on the envelope of violence and commitment to the military solution here as well, and he's not succeeded. You know, they make sort of a kilometre a day advance into Ukraine, and then sometimes lose that. You know, 2 kilometres forward, one back. So it strikes me that that's going to be highly visible to people as well. And you couldn't have a successor who was more extreme, but you could have successors who definitely want to sort Russia out and make it, you know, an economic powerhouse again.
Yeah, let's hope that's the case. That's for sure. I mean, because I'm very conscious you're short of time, so let's switch tack to NATO a little bit, because I mean, NATO at the moment is clearly facing one of, if not the biggest set of challenges since its creation with everything that's going on. It's clearly much bigger in terms of an alliance now. But as you said, when you were Secretary General and declared Article 5, you know, it was a challenge to get everybody on board. And I just wonder about cohesion in the face of what's going on, particularly when you look across the Atlantic at the American position at the moment and where Donald Trump is, and your perspectives on that for the alliance, given the obvious threat, not just from Russia, but I mean, clearly in terms of Europe, Russia is the nearest one that is probably crocodile to canoe, etc.
Well, it is, and I think that it's galvanized NATO in a way that was difficult to forecast. Vladimir Putin certainly counted on the Europeans falling apart, as they have done in the past. He counted on a breach between the Americans and the Europeans, and that hasn't happened at all. And he thought he could stop the onward march of NATO membership, and Spain, Finland, and Sweden have both joined the alliance since then, as well as stronger and more powerful. And the recent summit meeting, you know, Mark Rutte handled it with enormous skill and delftness. And everybody, including Donald Trump, signed up to Article 5, signed up to the objectives of the alliance as a whole. So when it comes to the crunch, NATO is completely united. Um, and is strong and formidable as a consequence of that. The American administration is going through an isolationist phase. I was in the United States last week, and there are signs of pulling up the drawbridge. We can be strong ourselves alone. Well, they tried that in the First World War. The Kaiser changed their mind. Second World War, the Japanese emperor changed their mind. 9/11, the Taliban and Mullah Omar changed their mind as well. Isolationism simply doesn't work for the protection of the American people and their safety and prosperity. And I think the Trump administration will eventually recognize that as well, and therefore make a major contribution to NATO. But the Europeans, at the same time, have got to change the imbalance in NATO, with much too much reliance on the United States and the special equipment and capabilities that they bring to the alliance. And the Europeans, I think, have woken up to that fact, spending much more and are much more focused on the right capabilities in order to be able to both sort the imbalance that exists within NATO, but also to protect their own people.
Yeah, I think we owe Donald Trump a kind of vote of thanks for that, actually, because I think he has definitely been the forcing function that has changed that behavior. And I completely subscribe to the view that we've been living under an American umbrella for far too long and been too weak on this ourselves. And I think that's a good segue actually into the last of these kind of questions I wanted to ask you, which is, yes, we had the SDR that you led. That's a great report that makes a lot of really good, comes to a lot of great conclusions and makes some really good recommendations. And there was a lot of I guess political airtime when it first came out, and there was a national security strategy at the same time. It feels to me a little bit that we've reverted quite quickly to talking about health, education, welfare, which are all really important, but there's some really difficult sums to be done in the UK and in other countries. And obviously, yes, at the summit, we committed all the countries, I think less Spain, if I'm not mistaken, committed to the 5%, which is terrific. But there's a difference between committing to that and making it an actual reality as opposed to just a political statement. And I'd just be interested again in your perspectives.
The fact is that, and I've said this regularly, we are underprepared, we're underinsured, and we're under attack. Our adversaries are attacking us all the time, and our free society, our democratic societies are highly vulnerable to cyber attack, sabotage. Our undersea cables that produce 99% of the data that we use today, our undersea pipelines, which bring 77% of all of our gas supplies to this country. That is a message that I think the public need to get. The Prime Minister promised in the Strategic Defence Review and the National Security Strategy to lead a national conversation about defence and security. And the sooner that's done, the better. What I worry about is that at some point, there'll be a massive cyber attack. The lights will go out, hospitals will shut, the data centers will melt when the air conditioning goes off, and our society will be in absolute turmoil. And at that point, the people are going to turn to the political leaders and say, "Why did you not warn us? Why did you not do something about this?" But we need to make the argument, because people are preoccupied by the cost of living, by the state of the National Health Service, by criminal justice, migration, whatever, and yet our adversaries are planning and organising and attacking all the time, and it can only get worse.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I hope you're right. I mean, I think it's such a challenging area in terms of seeing politicians, particularly sort of constituency level politicians, making those arguments, because of course it's a vote loser. If you start saying, right, we're going to cut health, we're going to cut welfare in order to pay for more defence, and people aren't actually feeling that existential threat, then that's a really big challenge, isn't it?
It is, but we need to make the argument. Those of us who know and appreciate what's going on have got to make the argument before the lights go out.
Yeah.
By that time, it's going to be too late. And the vulnerabilities that are huge. So the Strategic Defence Review basically sort of lays that out: the dangers, the problems, the risks that we face. But it also then says, but this is what we need to do: rebuild war-fighting readiness in order to create deterrence. We need to build up our armed forces in order that they're never used.
Yeah.
That's what deterrence is about.
Yeah, because the cost of going to war is much, much greater than the cost of deterring a war, isn't it? Clearly.
Yeah, but a lot of the cost of living increases that we're experiencing at the moment come from the invasion by Putin in Ukraine and driving up oil prices and food prices at the same time. So the costs are already being experienced, but they'll be a lot worse if an attack takes place.
Yeah, thanks. Just before I let you go, one question I always try and ask is, what's the most difficult question you've ever been asked?
I was asked once at a primary school in my constituency in Hamilton by a wee boy who got up and asked me a question to which I still don't know the answer. He said, "Why is it I can get married at the age of 16 and I can't vote until I'm 18? It was an interesting question. It might be resolved now if in Scotland they gave votes at 16, but that was certainly the most difficult question that I've ever had. And it was impossible to answer it.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I know you're really pressed for time and you've got a very busy day ahead of you. I really, really appreciate you joining, and so many great insights. Thank you very much indeed, George.
Okay, Bob, it's been a great pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this interview with Lord Robertson. What a privilege to have a man of his standing on the podcast. Really terrific stuff, and just so many phenomenal insights. It was just a wonderful conversation, and I feel very, very privileged to have had that opportunity. If you liked it, please share it, because the more people get to hear it, then that's better for the podcast. But also, actually, I think his words and what he had to say really deserves a wider audience. So please do think about how you push that out and circulate that to as many people as you can. If you really valued it, then please think about doing value for value and going to patreon.com, www.patreon.com/leadingforlife, or through the support the show link in the show notes to your podcast platform, or indeed the link that's in YouTube, and give me some financial support for the podcast. Less than a cup of coffee a month from a branded outlet, you're going to be making a big, big difference to what we do. So that will make a huge difference. But I love having you anyway. So even if you don't do that and you can't afford to do that, then I'm just privileged to have you as a listener or a viewer to what we do. More to come soon, but thanks very much indeed. Really appreciate it. Take care. Bye now.